The bus driver's voice cut through the morning crowd like a blade meant to wound. "Sir, I need you to give up that seat. We have passengers who actually need it." Raymond Kowalczyk looked up from the window, where he had been watching the city blur past, his weathered hands still folded in his lap with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural. The younger man standing over him wore a suit that cost more than Raymond's entire wardrobe, and his face carried the particular expression of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. "Some of us have important places to be," the younger man said, loud enough for the entire bus to hear. Raymond said nothing. He simply began to rise, his movements precise and unhurried despite the tremor in his fingers. What nobody on that bus knew, what the driver in his transit authority uniform could never have guessed, was that those hands had once held the lives of 200 Marines in a firefight that would be studied at Quantico for decades to come. And in exactly 4 stops, a man would board who would recognize the coordinates tattooed on that weathered forearm. When he did, everything would change. The bus lurched forward as Raymond gripped the overhead rail, his sleeve riding up just enough to reveal the faded ink beneath. Numbers, coordinates, and something else, something that looked like names written in a script too small to read from a distance. The younger man, Preston according to the name badge clipped to his expensive briefcase, settled into the seat with a satisfied sigh and immediately pulled out his phone. The bus driver, a thick-necked man whose name tag read G. Wilkes, watched the exchange in his mirror with something that looked almost like approval. "That's better," Wilkes announced over the PA system, his voice carrying that particular tone of petty authority that small men wield like weapons. "Let's keep the aisles clear and the seats available for passengers who need them." Raymond absorbed the words without flinching. He had absorbed worse. He had absorbed things that would break men half his age, and he had done it without complaint because complaint was not something he had ever learned how to do. Margaret used to say he was stubborn as bedrock. Margaret used to say a lot of things before the cancer took her voice and then took everything else. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice, and the heroes hidden among us speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten warriors walking our streets. Now let us continue. The bus stopped again and more passengers pressed aboard, forcing Raymond to shift his grip on the rail. A woman with a small child gave him a sympathetic look, but said nothing. A teenager with headphones glanced up from his phone, registered the scene, and looked away again. This was the geometry of public transportation, Raymond thought. Everyone saw. Nobody intervened. It was easier that way. Cleaner. He understood. He had learned long ago that most people preferred not to see the things that would require them to act. Preston was making a show of spreading out now, his briefcase on one side of him and his coat draped over the seat back. Taking up space. Establishing territory. Raymond watched this without expression, his face settling into the neutral mask he had perfected over 23 years of service. The mask that had kept him alive in Fallujah. The mask that had kept him functional in Al-Qaim when everything around him was fire and screaming and the wet sounds of men dying. "You can move further back," Wilkes called out, his eyes finding Raymond in the mirror again. "Plenty of room in the rear." Raymond nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that carried no submission in it, and began to make his way toward the back of the bus. His orthopedic shoes, held together more by habit than structural integrity, made soft sounds against the rubber floor. His corduroy jacket, patched at the elbows with thread that did not quite match, hung loose on a frame that had once been powerful. He moved past passengers who did not look up, past seats occupied by people who did not offer them, past the invisible barrier that separated those who mattered from those who had been deemed not to. A man near the back watched Raymond approach, with an expression that was difficult to read. Older, perhaps 60, with the kind of posture that suggested he had once stood at attention and never quite learned how to stop. His eyes tracked Raymond's movement with professional attention, lingering on the hands, the bearing, the almost imperceptible straightness of spine that no amount of age could fully erode. When Raymond reached for the overhead rail near him, the man's gaze dropped to the exposed forearm where the sleeve had ridden up again. The coordinates were clearly visible now. 34.4544 degrees north. 41.0081 degrees east. Numbers that meant nothing to most people on this bus. Numbers that would mean everything to anyone who had served in Al Anbar province during the bloodiest years of a war that most Americans had already begun to forget. The older man's face changed. Something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of it. But he said nothing. Not yet. The bus rolled on toward the next stop, carrying its cargo of commuters and secrets, and one old man who was trying very hard to simply reach his wife's grave without causing any trouble. Raymond's hand found the photograph in his pocket, the laminated edges worn smooth by years of touching. Margaret smiled up at him from summer 30 years gone, her hair still dark, her eyes still bright with the particular light that had guided him home from every deployment. 3 more stops. Then he could sit with her. Then he could tell her about his week, about the food at the facility, about the dreams that still woke him at 3 in the morning with Diego's last words echoing in his ears. Tell my mom I was brave, sir. 3 more stops, and none of this would matter. But the bus was slowing again. The doors were opening, and a man was boarding whose presence would ensure that Raymond Kowalczyk would not reach that cemetery unrecognized. The man moved through the fare payment with military efficiency, his civilian clothes doing nothing to disguise the bearing of someone who had commanded men in combat. Colonel Franklin Okonkwo, retired, scanned the crowded bus for a place to stand. His eyes passed over Raymond once, twice, and then they stopped on the tattoo, on the coordinates on the faded eagle globe, an anchor that marked a man who had earned the right to wear it. The colonel's face went pale. His hand found the nearest rail with the grip of someone who had just seen a ghost. Because in a way, he had. The morning had begun the way all of Raymond's mornings began now, with the slow recognition that Margaret was not beside him and never would be again. He had opened his eyes in the small room at the Veterans Home of Greater Cincinnati, stared at the ceiling tiles he had memorized over 18 months of waking alone, and forced himself through the rituals that kept him tethered to the living. Shower. Shave. The careful selection of clothes that were clean if not new, pressed if not fashionable. Margaret had always laid out his clothes the night before a trip. She had done it for 27 years of marriage, through deployments and homecomings and all the ordinary days in between. Now he did it himself, and every morning the absence of her hands on his collar felt like a wound reopening. He had taken the photograph from his nightstand, the one in the laminated sleeve that protected it from the oils of his fingers and the occasional tear that fell without warning. Margaret at 32, standing in the backyard of the house they had bought with his captain's salary and her nursing income. The house he had sold 8 months after she died, because he could not bear to walk through rooms that still smelled like her perfume. The money had gone to the grandchildren, to college funds they would not need to worry about, to a future he would not live to see. It was the right thing to do. Margaret would have approved. Margaret always knew the right thing to do. The bus swayed and Raymond's grip tightened on the overhead rail, pulling him back from the memory into the present where Preston was laughing at something on his phone and Wilkes was announcing the next stop with the voice of a man who believed himself important. Raymond's forearm ached where it pressed against the metal rail, the old shrapnel wounds protesting as they always did when the weather was about to change. He had carried those fragments home from Fallujah like souvenirs he had never wanted, little pieces of an IED that had killed 3 of his men and left him standing in the blood-soaked street, wondering why God or fate or simple geometry had chosen him to survive. The colonel was still staring at him. Raymond could feel the weight of that gaze, even without turning to meet it. He knew what the man had seen. He knew what those coordinates meant to anyone who had served in Al Anbar province during the surge. 34.4544 north. 41.0081 east. The grid reference for a village called Huzeba, where Raymond had led his battalion through 72 hours of continuous combat during Operation Steel Curtain, where he had carried Corporal Restrepo through 400 meters of enemy fire with rounds snapping past his ears and the young man's blood soaking through his uniform. where he had held Diego's hand while the life drained out of him and promised to tell his mother that her son had been brave. He still wrote to Maria Restrepo every month, a letter in his careful handwriting, telling her about the weather and the news and the small victories of men he had helped through the VA program before Margaret got sick. He never told her about the nightmares. He never told her that her son's face was the first thing he saw when he closed his eyes and the last thing he saw before sleep finally took him. Some burdens were not meant to be shared. Some weights were meant to be carried alone. The older man who had been watching Raymond from his seat near the back leaned forward slightly, his eyes still fixed on the tattoo. Raymond recognized the posture, the calculating assessment of a veteran sizing up another veteran. The man had served. That much was obvious from the way he held himself, from the unconscious discipline in his movements. But he had not yet spoken, had not yet made the connection that the colonel near the front of the bus had clearly made. Perhaps he was waiting. Perhaps he was uncertain. Perhaps he simply understood that some men preferred their anonymity and was respecting that preference. Margaret had never understood why Raymond refused to talk about his service. She had supported him, had loved him through the silence and the nightmares and the long nights when he sat on the back porch staring at nothing. But she had never truly understood. How could she? How could anyone who had not been there understand what it meant to order men into buildings where death waited behind every door? How could anyone who had not held a dying boy in their arms understand the weight of promises made to mothers who would never see their sons again? The bus stopped and more passengers departed, creating brief gaps in the crowd that closed again almost immediately as new riders boarded. Raymond watched the city pass through the scratched windows, recognizing landmarks that marked his progress toward the cemetery where Margaret waited. The coffee shop where they had gone on their first date, now a nail salon. The church where they had been married, now apartments. The park where their children had learned to ride bikes, now overgrown and forgotten. Everything changed. Everything passed. Only the dead remained constant, fixed in memory like photographs that never faded. Preston was on the phone now, his voice carrying through the bus with the particular volume of someone who wanted everyone to know how important his call was. The Henderson account needed attention. The quarterly projections require revision. Somebody named Martinez was not pulling his weight. Raymond listened without interest, his mind drifting to the last conversation he had with Margaret, the one where she had gripped his hand with strength that surprised him and told him that he was still her lieutenant colonel, that he still had battles to fight, that he was not allowed to follow her, not yet, not until he had finished whatever work remained for him in this world. He had not understood what she meant. He still did not understand. What work remained for a 74-year-old man with no home, no career, no purpose beyond visiting a grave twice a week? What battles were left for someone who had already fought more than his share and lost more than anyone should ever have to lose? Margaret had always seen things in him that he could not see in himself. Perhaps that was what love meant. Perhaps that was why her absence felt like amputation, like the removal of some essential organ that he had not known he needed until it was gone. The colonel was moving now, pushing through the crowd with a determination that suggested he had made a decision. His eyes never left Raymond's face as he navigated past passengers who stepped aside without understanding why. Raymond watched him approach with the calm resignation of a man who had faced worse things than recognition on a city bus. Whatever was coming, he would endure it. He had endured everything else. He would endure this too. But somewhere beneath the resignation, beneath the grief and the exhaustion and the bone-deep weariness of a life that had demanded too much for too long, something else stirred. Something that felt almost like anticipation, almost like hope, almost like the first faint light of a dawn he had stopped believing would ever come. The colonel stopped 3 feet from Raymond, close enough to read the faded ink on his forearm, close enough to see the small scars that mapped a history of violence across his weathered skin. His mouth opened and then closed again, as if the words he wanted to say had gotten tangled somewhere between his brain and his tongue. Raymond met his gaze with the patience of a man who had learned to wait in places where waiting meant the difference between living and dying. The bus lurched forward, and both men adjusted their balance without conscious thought, their bodies responding to decades of training that no amount of civilian life could fully erase. At the front of the bus, Preston had ended his phone call and was now scrolling through something on his screen with the aggressive thumb movements of a man who believed the digital world owed him entertainment. Wilkes guided the bus through traffic with one hand on the wheel and the other reaching for the coffee cup wedged into his console, his eyes flicking to the mirror every few seconds to monitor his domain. Neither of them noticed the silent confrontation happening in the rear of the vehicle. Neither of them understood that the balance of power on this bus was about to shift in ways they could not possibly anticipate. The colonel's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. Those coordinates. Raymond nodded once, a small movement that confirmed everything and explained nothing. Alcune, the colonel continued, his words carrying the weight of memory and loss. November 2005. Raymond said nothing. There was nothing to say. The coordinates spoke for themselves to anyone who knew how to read them, and this man clearly did. His eyes had the look of someone who had seen the classified reports, who had studied the after-action reviews, who understood what had happened in that village during those 72 hours when Raymond's battalion had held the line against odds that should have been impossible. A young woman near the back of the bus had pulled out her phone and was recording something, her lens pointed in their direction with the casual invasiveness of a generation that documented everything. Maya Chun, according to the university lanyard around her neck, graduate student in journalism. She had been watching the confrontation from the beginning, Raymond realized. She had seen Wilkes humiliate him, had seen Preston claim his seat with the entitlement of someone who had never earned anything in his life, had seen the whole degrading performance and done what her generation did. She had recorded it. For what purpose, Raymond could not guess. Perhaps no purpose at all. Perhaps simply because recording had become as reflexive as breathing for people who had grown up with cameras in their pockets. The older man who had been watching from his seat stood up slowly, his eyes moving between Raymond and the colonel with growing comprehension. He was putting pieces together. Raymond could see it in his face. The coordinates, the bearing, the age that matched the timeline of operations that had shaped a generation of Marines. This man had served too, probably Army from the way he carried himself, probably enlisted from the calluses on his hands. He knew enough to recognize that something significant was happening, even if he did not yet know exactly what. Wilkes hit the brakes harder than necessary at the next stop, sending standing passengers stumbling into each other with muttered apologies and irritated glances. Raymond absorbed the impact without moving, his core stabilizing automatically against the deceleration. The colonel did the same, their bodies betraying them even as their civilian clothes tried to disguise what they were. What they had been. What they would always be, no matter how many years passed or how many wars faded from public memory. More passengers boarded, pressing the crowd tighter, forcing Raymond and the colonel closer together. A mother with two small children squeezed past them toward an open seat, her face tight with the exhaustion of someone who had been awake since before dawn. Raymond stepped aside to let her pass, his movement automatic and graceful despite his age. The colonel watched this small courtesy with an expression that Raymond could not quite read. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of a kindness that cost nothing but meant everything. Preston's voice cut through the ambient noise of the bus, loud and complaining. "Can we move it along? Some of us have meetings." Wilkes responded with exaggerated patience, his tone carrying the false sympathy of a man who enjoyed the suffering of others. "We're running on schedule, sir. Traffic is what it is." The exchange drew glances from nearby passengers, rolled eyes, and shared looks of resignation. This was the daily theater of public transportation, the small cruelties and petty tyrannies that people endured because the alternative was worse. The colonel leaned closer to Raymond, his voice dropping even lower. "I studied your operation at the War College. What you did in Huzeba. The way you held that position for 3 days with no resupply and half your men wounded." Raymond's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He did not like hearing his actions described as things to be studied. He did not like the idea of men in classrooms analyzing decisions he had made with blood on his hands and screaming in his ears. War was not an academic exercise. War was Diego Restrepo bleeding out in his arms while enemy rounds tore through the walls around them. War was writing letters to mothers and wives and children who would never see their loved ones again. "I was just doing my job," Raymond said quietly. The colonel shook his head, a small movement that carried enormous weight. "No, what you did was something else." The bus rolled on toward the next stop, carrying its cargo of commuters and secrets, and one old man who wanted nothing more than to visit his wife's grave in peace. But peace, Raymond was beginning to understand, was not going to be possible today. The colonel's eyes held questions that demanded answers. The young woman's camera held evidence that would not be forgotten. And somewhere in the front of the bus, a driver and a businessman continued their performance of casual cruelty, unaware that the audience was about to turn against them. 2 more stops until the cemetery. 2 more stops until Raymond could escape this bus and lose himself in the quiet company of the dead. But the colonel was not finished. His hand reached out and touched Raymond's forearm, gentle as a prayer, his fingers tracing the coordinates that had been inked into skin that had known fire and shrapnel and the desperate grip of dying men. "This mark," the colonel said. "I know what it means. I know what you lost." Raymond looked down at the hand on his arm, at the coordinates that pointed to a place where his soul had been broken and rebuilt into something harder and sadder and more resilient than he had ever imagined possible. He thought of Diego. He thought of Margaret. He thought of all the men he had led and all the men he had buried and all the years he had spent trying to forget things that refused to be forgotten. One more stop now. Just one more stop until the cemetery. But Raymond was beginning to suspect that he would not make it there unrecognized. The colonel's touch on his arm felt like both a blessing and a curse, an acknowledgement of who he had been and a reminder of everything he had lost becoming it. Margaret had been the one to find a lump. She had been standing in front of the bathroom mirror on a Tuesday morning, running her fingers along her collarbone the way she did when she was thinking, and her hand had stopped moving. Raymond had been shaving at the sink beside her, watching her reflection with the casual attention of a man who had memorized his wife's face over 3 decades of marriage. He had seen her expression change. He had seen the color drain from her cheeks. He had known, in that instant, that their lives were about to split into before and after. The diagnosis came 3 days later. Stage 4. Metastatic. Words that sounded like artillery rounds impacting soft earth, each one tearing holes in the future they had planned together. The oncologist had spoken about treatment options and survival rates and quality of life considerations, but Raymond had stopped listening after the word terminal. He had held Margaret's hand in that sterile office and felt the same helpless rage he had experienced in Al-Qaim when the RPG had taken Diego's legs, and there was nothing he could do but hold the boy while he bled. She had lived for 14 months after the diagnosis. 14 months of chemotherapy and radiation and the slow diminishment of the woman who had been his anchor for 27 years. Raymond had retired from the consulting work he had taken up after leaving the Corps. He had sold the rental properties they had accumulated over decades of careful saving. He had dedicated every waking moment to her care, sleeping in a chair beside her hospital bed during the bad nights, carrying her to the bathroom when she was too weak to walk, reading to her from the novel she had always loved but never had time to finish. The bus shuddered over a pothole and Raymond's hand tightened on the overhead rail, the memory of Margaret's final night washing over him with the force of a wave breaking against stone. She had been lucid at the end, more lucid than she had been in weeks. The morphine had cleared some pathway in her dying brain, had given her back the clarity that the cancer had stolen piece by piece. She had looked at him with eyes that still held the light he had fallen in love with 40 years ago, and she had told him that he was not allowed to follow her. "You still have work to do," she had said, her voice barely a whisper through cracked lips. "You still have battles to fight. Promise me you will not give up." Raymond had promised. He had held her hand and wept and promised her anything she asked because he could not bear to deny her anything in those final hours. He had not understood what she meant. He still did not understand. What battles remained for a man who had already buried too many friends and lost the only woman who had ever made sense of his broken pieces? The colonel was still standing beside him, his hand no longer touching the tattoo, but his presence still a weight that Raymond could feel in his bones. The younger man's eyes held questions that Raymond did not want to answer, memories he did not want to revisit, a past he had spent 18 months trying to bury alongside his wife. But the past, Raymond had learned, did not stay buried. The past clawed its way up through the soil of the present and demanded to be acknowledged, demanded to be honored, demanded to be carried forward by the living because the dead could no longer carry themselves. Maria Restrepo had sent him a photograph last Christmas. Diego at 18, grinning in his dress blues on the day of his graduation from boot camp. She had written on the back of it in handwriting that trembled with age and grief. He would have been 42 this year. Thank you for remembering him. Raymond had wept when he read those words. He had held the photograph against his chest and wept for a boy who would never grow old, for a mother who would never stop mourning, for all the years that should have been and never would be. The bus was slowing again, approaching the stop before the cemetery. Raymond could see the stone gates through the window, the iron letters spelling out the name of the place where Margaret waited for him. Riverside Memorial Gardens. They had chosen the plot together, years before either of them had gotten sick, because Margaret believed in planning ahead and Raymond had learned never to argue with her about practical matters. She had been right about everything practical. She had been right about most things, period. Preston stood up from his seat and stretched with exaggerated satisfaction, his movements designed to take up as much space as possible. He reached for the overhead rail, and his elbow caught the shoulder of an elderly woman standing nearby, a glancing blow that he did not acknowledge or apologize for. The woman stumbled slightly, her hand reaching for something to steady herself, and Raymond moved without thinking. His arm caught her elbow, stabilized her, guided her to a grip on the rail with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades protecting people who could not protect themselves. The woman looked up at him with surprise and gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. Raymond nodded once, a small acknowledgement that required no words. Preston glanced back at the interaction with an expression of mild irritation, as if the old man's act of kindness had somehow been directed at him personally. The bus driver caught the exchange in his mirror and smirked, his lips curling with the petty satisfaction of someone who enjoyed watching the weak struggle. One more stop. Raymond could see the cemetery gates clearly now, could almost smell the cut grass and the flowers that visitors left on graves they had not yet learned to stop visiting. Margaret was waiting for him there, under the oak tree she had chosen because she said she wanted shade in the summer and company in the fall when the leaves came down. He had planted roses at the base of her headstone, red ones because they had been her favorite, and he tended them twice a week with the same dedication he had once brought to leading men in combat. But the colonel was not going to let him go. Raymond could see it in the set of his jaw, in the determined light in his eyes. This man had recognized something that Raymond had spent 18 months trying to hide, and he was not the type to let it pass without acknowledgement. Whatever peace Raymond had hoped to find at Margaret's grave would have to wait. The past was not finished with him yet. The battles Margaret had spoken of were not the ones he had already fought. They were the ones still coming, the ones he could not yet see, the ones that would require him to remember who he had been before grief had hollowed him out and left him standing in the shell of a man who had once been called Shepherd. The bus ground to a halt at the stop before the cemetery, its brakes squealing with the protest of machinery that had not been properly maintained. Raymond watched the doors fold open, watched passengers shuffle off into the gray morning light, watched his chance at escape narrow with every person who departed. He should move now. He should slip through the crowd and step off this bus and disappear into the quiet rows of headstones where no one would ask him questions he did not want to answer. But his feet remained planted on the rubber floor, held in place by something stronger than the desire for solitude. The colonel had positioned himself between Raymond and the door, not blocking it exactly, but making it clear that any exit would require acknowledgement of his presence. It was a tactical move, the kind of positioning that came naturally to men who had spent their careers thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone around them. Raymond recognized it because he had used the same technique himself in interrogation rooms and negotiation tables and the countless small confrontations that made up a career in military leadership. The colonel was not going to let him go without a conversation. Preston pushed past them both, his shoulder catching Raymond's arm with unnecessary force. "Watch it, old-timer," he muttered without looking back, his phone already pressed to his ear as he stepped off the bus and into his important life full of important meetings. Raymond absorbed the impact without comment, his body shifting to maintain balance with the automatic grace of someone who had been absorbing impact for 74 years. The colonel watched Preston go with an expression that promised future consequences, his jaw tight, with the controlled anger of a man who understood the difference between authority and arrogance. Wilkes pulled the doors closed with a pneumatic hiss and guided the bus back into traffic, his eyes finding Raymond in the mirror with a look of smug satisfaction. "Next stop, Riverside Memorial," he announced over the PA, his voice carrying the tone of someone who enjoyed reminding passengers that their destinations were in his hands. Raymond felt the words land like small stones against his chest. Margaret's stop, the stop he had been riding toward twice a week for 18 months, through snow and rain and the suffocating heat of summer, because visiting her grave was the only thing that still made sense in a world that had stopped making sense the moment she stopped breathing. The older Army veteran who had been watching from his seat moved closer now, his interest apparently overwhelming his caution. He stood beside the colonel with the easy familiarity of men who recognized each other across the invisible boundaries of service and sacrifice. His eyes moved between Raymond's face and the tattoo on his forearm, putting together pieces of a puzzle that was becoming clearer with every passing moment. Raymond could see the questions forming behind his eyes, could feel the weight of scrutiny that he had spent 18 months avoiding. Maya Chun had lowered her phone, but not put it away, her thumb hovering over the screen with the readiness of someone prepared to resume recording at any moment. She had moved closer to, drawn by the current of tension that was building in the back of the bus like pressure before a storm. The other passengers remained oblivious, lost in their phones and their thoughts and the private concerns that consumed them more completely than anything happening around them. But these 3, the colonel and the veteran and the young woman with her camera, had become an audience that Raymond could not ignore. "You are him," the colonel said finally, his voice low but certain. "Lieutenant-Colonel Raymond Kowalczyk. Call sign Shepard." The words hung in the air between them, each syllable carrying the weight of a past that Raymond had tried so hard to leave behind. He did not confirm or deny. He simply stood there, his hand on the overhead rail, his eyes fixed on the cemetery gates growing larger through the scratched window. The Army veteran exhaled sharply, recognition flooding his weathered face. "I read about Steel Curtain when I was at Fort Benning," he said quietly. "What you did in Huzaiba. The way you held that village against 3 companies of insurgents with nothing but your Marines and your will. That operation changed doctrine. That operation saved lives for years afterward because of what you taught us about urban defense." Raymond closed his eyes briefly, memories washing over him like water through a broken dam. The sounds of that battle still lived in his dreams. The screams of wounded men and the crack of rifle fire and the earth-shaking thunder of artillery called in danger close because there was no other option. The smell of cordite and blood and burning buildings. The feel of Diego's hand growing cold in his grip while he whispered promises he could never keep. "I lost 11 men in that village," Raymond said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words came out before he could stop them, dragged from some deep place that he had tried to seal shut. 11 families that got folded flags instead of fathers and sons and brothers. 11 names I carry with me every single day. The colonel nodded slowly, his expression shifting from recognition to something deeper, something that looked like understanding. The bus was slowing again, approaching the cemetery stop. Raymond could see the iron gates clearly now, could see the gravel path that led to the section where Margaret waited beneath her oak tree. His chest ached with the need to be there, to sit on the small bench he had placed beside her headstone, to tell her about the bus and the driver and the businessman who had demanded his seat. She would have been furious on his behalf. She would have marched to the front of that bus and given Wilkes a piece of her mind that he would never forget. That was Margaret. That was the woman who had loved him through 30 years of war and peace and everything in between. But the bus was not stopping. Raymond watched the cemetery gates slide past the window, watched his destination disappear behind them as Wilkes continued driving without pause. He turned toward the front of the bus, confusion cutting through the fog of memory. The PA system crackled to life with Wilkes's voice, smug and satisfied. "Sorry, folks, running a bit behind schedule. Skipping the memorial stop today. You can catch the next bus back." Raymond's hand tightened on the rail until his knuckles went white. 18 months of visits. 18 months of faithful pilgrimage to Margaret's grave. And now this small tyrant in his transit authority uniform had decided that today would be different. Today, Raymond would not see his wife. Today, the schedule mattered more than grief. Something shifted in Raymond's posture. It was a small change, almost imperceptible to anyone who had not spent years reading the body language of men under pressure. His shoulders squared, his spine straightened. The tremor in his hands disappeared as if it had never existed. The colonel saw it happen, and his breath caught in his throat. The Army veteran took an involuntary step backward. Maya Chan raised her phone and began recording again, some instinct telling her that whatever was about to happen was worth documenting. The old man in the worn corduroy jacket was gone. In his place stood something else entirely. Something that radiated quiet authority the way a furnace radiates heat. Raymond released his grip on the overhead rail and began walking toward the front of the bus, his orthopedic shoes making soft sounds against the rubber floor that suddenly seemed very loud in the silence that had fallen over the rear passengers. His movements were fluid now, economical, each step placed with the precision of someone who had learned to walk through minefields without making a sound. Wilkes caught the movement in his mirror, and his smirk faltered. "Hey," he called out, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that had not been there before. "Sir, I need you to remain seated while the bus is in motion." Raymond did not stop. He did not acknowledge the command. He simply continued walking forward, past passengers who pressed themselves against their seats to let him pass, past the mother with her 2 children who watched him with wide eyes, past Preston's empty seat that still seemed to carry the ghost of entitled arrogance. The colonel followed 3 steps behind, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough to give Raymond space to do whatever he was about to do. The Army veteran fell in behind the colonel, forming a small procession of men who recognized the bearing of command and responded to it instinctively. Maya Chan brought up the rear, her phone held steady, her journalist's instinct telling her that this was the moment the story had been building toward. "Sir," Wilkes said again, louder this time, his hand moving toward the radio clipped to his belt. "I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat, or I will be forced to call transit security." Raymond stopped 3 feet from the driver's seat, his position blocking the aisle completely. He stood at parade rest, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on Wilkes with an intensity that made the driver's hand freeze halfway to the radio. "You skipped my stop," Raymond said. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the bus like thunder rolling across distant mountains. The passengers who had been ignoring the drama unfolding around them looked up from their phones, drawn by something in that voice that demanded attention. There was no anger in it, no threat, just a calm statement of fact that somehow felt more dangerous than any shout could have been. Wilkes swallowed visibly, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thick neck. "Schedule," he said, his voice cracking slightly on the word. "We were running behind. Had to make up time." Raymond nodded slowly, as if considering this explanation. His eyes never left the driver's face. "My wife is buried in that cemetery," Raymond said. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples through every passenger within earshot. "I visit her twice a week. I have visited her twice a week for 18 months. Through snow, through heat, through days when getting out of bed felt like climbing Everest. I ride this bus because the walk and the ride keep me connected to the world she left behind. And today you decided that your schedule was more important than my grief." Wilkes opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His face had gone pale, the smugness draining away like water through sand. The passengers around him had gone very still, their phones forgotten, their attention fixed entirely on the old man standing in the aisle with the bearing of a general and the grief of a widower. The colonel moved forward and stood beside Raymond, his presence adding weight to the moment. "Do you know who this man is?" he asked Wilkes, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command. The driver shook his head, a small jerky movement that betrayed his growing discomfort. "Raymond Kowalczyk, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Marine Corps, retired. Navy Cross recipient. The man who held Huzaybah during Operation Steel Curtain when every tactical analysis said it could not be held." Wilkes blinked rapidly, processing information that did not fit the narrative he had constructed in his head. The old man in the shabby jacket. The passenger he had humiliated for the amusement of a businessman in a nice suit. The person whose grief he had dismissed as an inconvenience to his schedule. That man was a decorated combat veteran. That man was a hero whose actions had been studied at war colleges around the world. "I did not know," Wilkes said weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "How was I supposed to know?" Raymond's expression did not change. "That is precisely the point," he said quietly. "You were not supposed to know. You were supposed to treat every passenger on this bus with basic human dignity regardless of what you knew or did not know about them. You were supposed to understand that every person you encounter might be carrying burdens you cannot see. That old woman you let get elbowed by that businessman. She might be visiting her husband's grave too. That teenager with the headphones. He might be going to see his mother in hospice. You do not know. You cannot know. And because you cannot know, you should err on the side of kindness." The bus had rolled to a stop at some point during his speech, pulled over to the side of the road by a driver whose hands were shaking too badly to continue operating the vehicle safely. Traffic flowed past them, commuters and delivery trucks, and all the ordinary machinery of a city that did not know or care about the small drama unfolding inside a Route 42 Express. But inside that bus, something had changed. The air itself felt different, charged with the electricity of truth spoken aloud to someone who needed to hear it. The silence on the bus stretched like a held breath, every passenger frozen in the amber of the moment. Raymond stood motionless at the front of the aisle, his eyes still fixed on Wilkes with that quiet intensity that seemed to see through flesh and bone to the small, frightened thing underneath. The driver's hands gripped the steering wheel as if it were the only solid thing left in a world that had suddenly tilted beneath his feet. His knuckles had gone white, matching the color that had drained from his face. Raymond could walk away now. He could turn around and wait for the bus to resume its route, could ride back to the cemetery stop and visit Margaret the way he had planned. The point had been made. The lesson had been delivered. There was nothing more to be gained by standing here in the aisle of a city bus, surrounded by strangers who were watching him with expressions that ranged from awe to discomfort to something that looked almost like hope. He could let it end here. But Margaret's voice echoed in his memory, soft and insistent the way it had been in those final hours when the morphine had cleared her mind and let her speak the truths she had been saving. "You still have battles to fight. You still have work to do." He had not understood what she meant. He had spent 18 months wandering through grief like a man lost in fog, unable to see more than a few feet in any direction. But standing here now, looking at the shattered expression on a bully's face, he began to understand. The battles were not the ones he had already fought. The battles were the ones that found him when he stopped running. The colonel cleared his throat softly, drawing Raymond's attention without demanding it. "Sir," he said, the honorific coming naturally despite the civilian setting. "The bus has stopped. Perhaps we could." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Raymond understood the offer. A graceful exit. A way to step back from the confrontation without losing the ground that had been gained. It was the kind of tactical suggestion that good officers learn to make, giving their commanders options without presuming to make decisions for them. Raymond considered the offer for a long moment. Behind him, He could feel the weight of attention from every passenger on the bus. The mother with her children, watching with protective concern. The teenagers who had looked up from their phones for perhaps the first time in hours. The elderly woman he had steadied earlier, her eyes bright with tears she was not quite shedding. Maya-chan with her phone, still recording, documenting everything for an audience that did not yet exist, but surely would. The Army veteran, standing at attention without seeming to realize he was doing it. All of them waiting to see what he would do next. He thought about Diego Restrepo, bleeding out in a dusty street in Al-Qaim with the sounds of battle raging around them. He thought about the promise he had made to a dying boy, the promise to tell his mother that her son had been brave. He kept that promise. He had written to Maria Restrepo every month for 19 years, had sent her photographs of the memorial services, had made sure she knew that her son's sacrifice had not been forgotten. That was what you did when someone trusted you with their last words. You carried them forward. You honored them with action. Margaret had trusted him with her last words too. You still have battles to fight. And here, on a city bus that smelled of diesel and humanity and the accumulated small griefs of 1,000 commuters, Raymond finally understood what she had meant. The battle was not about Wilkes. It was not about Preston or the seat or the skipped stop or any of the petty cruelties that had sparked this confrontation. The battle was about something larger, something that mattered beyond this moment and this bus and this single day in a life that had stretched across 7 decades of service and loss. Every person you pass on the street is carrying something, Raymond said, his voice quiet but somehow reaching every corner of the bus. Every old man in a shabby jacket, every young mother with tired eyes, every teenager who seems lost in their phone. They're all fighting battles you cannot see. They are all carrying wounds you cannot imagine. And most of them, he paused, his eyes sweeping across the passengers who hung on his every word, most of them will never tell you what those battles are, because they have learned that the world does not want to know. They have learned that it is easier to be invisible than to be seen and judged and found wanting. He turned back to Wilkes, who had not moved since the bus had stopped. The driver's eyes were wet now, tears gathering in the corners that he was trying desperately not to let fall. Raymond recognized that expression. He had seen it on the faces of young Marines who had made mistakes that cost lives, who had learned too late the weight of the responsibilities they carried. There was shame in that expression, and beneath the shame, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. I was invisible to you, Raymond continued. I was just an obstacle, an inconvenience, something to be managed and moved and forgotten. And I could have stayed invisible. I could have given up my seat and ridden in the back and gotten off at my stop, and you would never have known or cared who I was. But my wife. He stopped, the words catching in his throat like thorns. My wife believed that I still had something left to give. She believed that even after everything I'd seen and done and lost, there was still a purpose waiting for me. I did not believe her. For 18 months, I did not believe her. But standing here now, looking at you, I am beginning to think she might have been right. The bus sat motionless at the side of the road, its engine idling with a low rumble that seemed to underscore the weight of the moment. Outside, the world continued its indifferent rotation, cars passing, pedestrians walking, the machinery of civilization grinding forward without pause. But inside the bus, time had stopped. Inside the bus, a small group of strangers had become witnesses to something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The Army veteran stepped forward, his voice rough with emotion he was not quite managing to conceal. "Sir, if I may." Raymond turned slightly, acknowledging the man with a small nod. The veteran swallowed hard, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides in the manner of someone wrestling with words that did not want to come out. "I did 3 tours," the veteran said. "Afghanistan, Kandahar province. I saw things that I still cannot talk about, not even to my wife, not even to the therapist the VA assigned me when I finally admitted I needed help. I came home broken in ways that do not show on the outside. And for years, I thought that made me weak. I thought the fact that I could not just shake it off and move on meant there was something wrong with me." He paused, his eyes fixed on Raymond with an intensity that bordered on desperate. But watching you just now, listening to you talk about carrying things that other people cannot see, I realized something. The strength is not in pretending the weight does not exist. The strength is in carrying it anyway. The strength is in getting up every morning and riding the bus to visit your wife's grave, even when every part of you wants to stay in bed and let the world forget you exist. Raymond felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight, knot that had lived there since Margaret's funeral. He had spent so long believing that his grief was a private burden, something to be endured in silence and solitude. He had not considered that his persistence might mean something to someone else. He had not imagined that the simple act of continuing to exist might constitute a form of courage that others could recognize and draw strength from. The mother with the 2 children had risen from her seat, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder. "My husband was a Marine," she said quietly. "He did not come home from his second deployment. Some days I do not know how I'm going to make it to the end of the day, let alone the end of the week or the month or the year. But I keep going because my children need me to keep going, and because I promised them I would." One by one, passengers began to speak. The teenager with the headphones, whose father had died of cancer 6 months ago, and who rode this bus every day because it passed the hospital where he had spent his final weeks. The elderly woman Raymond had steadied, whose husband of 53 years had succumbed to dementia and no longer recognized her face when she visited him at the care facility. A young man in a paramedic uniform who had lost a patient the night before, a child, and who was on his way home to cry in the shower where his roommates could not hear him. The bus had become a confessional, a small metal chapel moving through a city that had no idea what was happening inside its walls. Wilkes sat frozen in his driver's seat, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks, his hands still gripping the wheel, as if letting go would mean falling into some abyss he could not see the bottom of. The colonel stood at attention, his face a mask of controlled emotion, his eyes bright with tears he was too disciplined to let fall. Maya Chun had lowered her phone, no longer recording, simply bearing witness to something that felt too sacred to document. Raymond listened to each story with the same focused attention he had once given to mission briefings and after-action reports. Each voice added weight to the truth he had spoken, each confession proof that the invisible battles were everywhere, fought by people who had learned to suffer in silence because they believed no one wanted to hear about their pain. The bus was full of walking wounded, survivors of losses that would never make the news, veterans of wars that had no names and no medals and no parades. When the last voice fell silent, Raymond turned back to Wilkes. The driver looked like a man who had been dismantled and was not sure how to put himself back together. His face was wet with tears, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs, his entire body radiating the particular anguish of someone who has just realized the magnitude of harm they have casually inflicted on others. "I did not know," Wilkes whispered, the words barely audible over the idle of the engine. "I did not know any of this. I just saw." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Raymond finished it for him. "You just saw an old man in a shabby jacket. You just saw someone who did not matter. Someone whose time and grief and dignity were less important than your schedule and your authority and the approval of a man in an expensive suit." Wilkes nodded miserably, accepting the indictment without defense. Raymond studied the driver for a long moment, reading the genuine anguish in his face, weighing it against the cruelty he had witnessed at the beginning of this journey. There was a version of this moment where he could destroy this man. He could demand his job, could ensure that the recording Maya Chun had made went viral, could turn this bus driver into a cautionary tale that would follow him for the rest of his life. It would be justified. It would be fair. It would be exactly what Wilkes deserved for the way he had treated Raymond and who knew how many others before him. But Margaret's voice whispered in his memory again, gentle and insistent. "The battles worth fighting are not the ones that destroy your enemies. They're the ones that heal your soul." Raymond had destroyed enough enemies in his lifetime. He had called in airstrikes and led assaults and made decisions that ended lives with the cold efficiency that were demanded. He knew how to destroy. He had spent decades perfecting the art of destruction. Perhaps it was time to learn something else. What happens now, Wilkes asked, his voice cracking on each word, is entirely up to you. Raymond let the statement hang in the air for a moment, watching the driver's face cycle through fear and shame and desperate hope. The other passengers watched too, waiting to see what mercy or judgment would be rendered by the old man who had been humiliated and was now holding all the power. Raymond reached into the inside pocket of his corduroy jacket, his fingers finding the familiar shape of the laminated photograph he had carried every day for 18 months. He drew it out slowly, handling it with the reverence of a priest handling sacred relics. Margaret smiled up at him from that summer 30 years gone, her eyes holding the light that had guided him through wars and peacetime and all the ordinary days that made up a life. "This is my wife," Raymond said, holding the photograph so Wilkes could see it. Her name was Margaret. She was a nurse for 31 years. She held the hands of dying patients when their families could not be there. She wrote letters to the mothers of my men who did not come home, because she knew I did not have the words, and she always did. She made me a better man than I had any right to be. He turned the photograph so the other passengers could see it too, this woman they had never met, but who had somehow become central to the story unfolding on this bus. She taught me that strength without compassion is just cruelty wearing a uniform. She taught me that the measure of a man is not how he treats those above him, but how he treats those who can do nothing for him. She taught me that forgiveness is not weakness. It is the hardest form of strength there is. Wilkes stared at the photograph with red-rimmed eyes, his breath coming in shallow gasps that sounded almost like sobs. The woman in the picture looked kind. She looked like someone who would have smiled at him when she boarded his bus, who would have thanked him when she departed, who would have seen him as a person rather than a function. She looked like someone whose grave her husband should never have been prevented from visiting. "I could destroy you," Raymond said quietly, and the words carried no threat, only truth. "I could make sure this recording reaches every news station in the city. I could file complaints that would cost you your job and follow you for years. I could turn this moment into the worst day of your life, and I would be justified in doing so." Wilkes nodded miserably, accepting the verdict before it was even delivered. His hands had fallen from the steering wheel and lay limp in his lap, the hands of a man who had already surrendered to whatever punishment was coming. "But Margaret would not want that," Raymond continued. "She would tell me that broken people do not need more breaking. She would tell me that the only way to stop the cycle of small cruelties is to replace them with small mercies. She would tell me that you are probably carrying your own invisible battles, your own wounds that I cannot see, your own reasons for becoming the kind of man who finds satisfaction in humiliating strangers." The colonel shifted slightly, his expression unreadable. The Army veteran wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Maya Chun stood absolutely still, her phone forgotten, her attention fixed entirely on the old man who had transformed from victim to judge to something else entirely. Something that looked almost like a priest offering absolution to a penitent sinner. "So here is what is going to happen," Raymond said. "You're going to turn this bus around. You're going to take me back to the cemetery stop that you skipped, and then you're going to continue your route, and you're going to treat every passenger who boards this bus for the rest of your career as if they might be carrying the same weight I am carrying. You're going to choose kindness, not because you are afraid of consequences, but because you have seen what cruelty costs. Can you do that?" The question hung in the air, simple and profound. Wilkes looked up at Raymond with an expression of disbelief, as if he could not quite process the mercy being offered to him. He had expected destruction. He had braced himself for the end of his career, the viral humiliation, the judgment of a world that loved to watch bullies fall. Instead, he was being offered something far more difficult than punishment. He was being offered the chance to become a different kind of man. "Yes," Wilkes said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Yes, sir. I can do that. I will do that." Raymond studied him for a long moment, reading the sincerity in his face, weighing it against the cruelty he had witnessed. Then he nodded once, a small gesture of acceptance that seemed to release something in the driver's chest. Wilkes exhaled shakily, his whole body sagging with relief that was almost painful to witness. The colonel stepped forward, his hand extended toward Raymond. "Sir," he said, "it has been an honor to witness this." Raymond looked at the offered hand, then up at the face of a man who understood exactly what had just happened. He reached out and clasped the colonel's hand firmly, two officers acknowledging each other across the invisible bonds of service and sacrifice. "The honor is mine," Raymond said quietly. "And Margaret's. She always believed people could change if someone gave them the chance. I spent most of my career taking chances away from people. Perhaps it is time I started giving them instead." The bus engine rumbled as Wilkes put the vehicle back in gear, carefully checking his mirrors before pulling back onto the road. The passengers settled into their seats, the extraordinary moment beginning to fade into something that would become memory, then story, then legend told to children and grandchildren about the day they rode a bus where a broken man found redemption and a grieving widower found his purpose. Raymond returned to his place near the back of the bus, his hand finding the overhead rail with the easy grace of someone who had made peace with his balance in the world. The colonel and the Army veteran flanked him without being asked, an honor guard for a man who had refused the honors he had earned. Myachin caught his eye and nodded once, a small gesture of respect that required no words. The cemetery gates were approaching again, visible through the scratched windows, like a promise finally being kept. The bus rolled to a stop at the cemetery gates with a gentleness that had not been present in any of Wilkes's previous stops. The doors opened with their pneumatic hiss, and Raymond moved toward them, his steps measured and unhurried. He had waited 18 months to understand why Margaret believed he still had battles to fight. A few more seconds would not change anything. But as he reached the front of the bus, Wilkes spoke. "Sir." Raymond paused, turning to look at the driver whose face still bore the tracks of tears he had not tried to hide. Wilkes reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a worn photograph of his own, edges soft with handling, colors faded with age. "My son," Wilkes said, his voice barely above a whisper. He was a corporal in the Army, killed by an IED in Ramadi in 2007. He was 22 years old. Raymond looked at the photograph, at the young face grinning in desert camouflage, at the eyes that held the same mix of fear and determination he had seen in so many young men who had served under his command. He understood now. He understood the source of the bitterness that had curdled into cruelty, the grief that had hardened into contempt for a world that kept spinning after it should have stopped. "I blamed everyone," Wilkes continued, the words pouring out like water through a broken dam. "I blamed the military for sending him. I blamed the politicians for starting the war. I blamed the veterans who came home when my boy did not. I blamed anyone who reminded me of what I lost. And somewhere along the way, I forgot that they were people too. I forgot that they might be hurting just as badly as I was." Raymond reached out and placed his hand on Wilkes's shoulder, a gesture of connection that surprised them both. "Your son was brave," he said quietly. "Every young man and woman who put on that uniform and went into those streets was brave in ways that most people will never understand. And the ones who did not come home, they are not gone. They are carried forward by the ones who did. They are carried forward by their families. They are carried forward by every person who remembers their name and honors their sacrifice." Wilkes broke then, truly broke, his shoulders shaking with sobs that had been building for 17 years. The passengers watched in silence as the bus driver wept for a son he had never stopped mourning, for a grief he had never learned to carry properly, for all the strangers he had hurt because hurting them was easier than feeling his own pain. The colonel moved forward and stood beside Raymond, his presence adding weight to the moment without words. The Army veteran followed, and then the mother whose husband had not come home, and then one by one the other passengers who had shared their own invisible battles. They gathered around Wilkes in a circle of understanding that transcended the boundaries of strangers on public transportation. "What was his name?" Raymond asked gently. Wilkes looked up, his face wet and raw and somehow more human than it had been at any point during the journey. "David," he said. "David Michael Wilkes. He wanted to be a teacher when he got out. He wanted to coach Little League and teach history and make a difference in kids' lives. He had so many plans." Raymond nodded slowly, filing the name away in the same mental space where he kept the names of his own fallen. David Michael Wilkes. Another young man who would never grow old. Another son whose mother and father would carry the weight of his absence until they joined him in whatever came after this world. "I will remember him," Raymond said, and the words carried the gravity of a sacred vow. "I will add his name to the others I carry. And when I visit my wife today, I will tell her about him. I will tell her about a father who lost his way in grief and found it again on a city bus in Cincinnati." Wilkes stared at him with an expression that defied description, gratitude and shame and wonder all tangled together in a face that had forgotten how to feel anything but anger. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." The words were inadequate, but they were all he had. Raymond squeezed his shoulder once more, then turned and stepped off the bus into the gray morning light. The cemetery gates stood before him, iron letters spelling out the name of the place where Margaret waited. Behind him, he heard the doors close and the engine rumble as Wilkes prepared to continue his route. But something had changed. Something fundamental had shifted in the space between one stop and the next. The colonel appeared beside him, having exited through the rear doors. The Army veteran stood on his other side. Maya Chun emerged last, her phone still in her pocket, her face thoughtful in the way of someone processing an experience that would take time to fully understand. "Sir," the colonel said, "I would be honored to accompany you, if you would permit it." Raymond looked at the three people who had become witnesses to the most unexpected morning of his life. He thought about Margaret, about what she would say if she could see him now. She would smile, he knew. She would tell him that this was exactly what she meant, that the battles worth fighting were the ones that connected people instead of destroying them, that strength without compassion was just cruelty wearing a uniform, but strength with compassion was something else entirely. "She would have liked you," Raymond said quietly, addressing all three of them. "She would have invited you in for coffee and asked about your lives and made you feel like the most important people in the world. That was her gift, making people feel seen." He turned toward the cemetery gates, toward the oak tree where Margaret waited beneath the roses he had planted in her memory. The colonel fell in a step beside him, the Army veteran and Maya Chun following at a respectful distance. They walked together through the iron gates, for strangers bound by a morning that none of them would ever forget. The oak tree stood exactly where Margaret had chosen it, its branches bare in the January cold, but still somehow welcoming, still somehow right. Raymond led his small procession down the gravel path that wound through rows of headstones, past names and dates that told stories of lives lived and lost, past flowers fresh and wilted, past the accumulated grief of a city's worth of mourners. His feet knew this path. His body had memorized every turn, every slope, every crack in the pavement where rainwater pooled after storms. Margaret's headstone came into view, the gray granite catching the weak morning light. The roses he had planted at its base had gone dormant for winter, their thorny branches stripped of leaves, but still standing sentinel over the ground where she rested. Raymond stopped a few feet away, suddenly uncertain of himself in a way he had not expected. He had made this visit alone so many times. He had grown accustomed to the solitude, to the privacy of his grief, to the conversations he whispered to a woman who could no longer answer. But today he was not alone. Today he had witnesses, and somehow that changed everything. The colonel seemed to sense his hesitation. He stopped walking, gesturing for the others to do the same. "We can wait here, sir. Give you privacy." Raymond considered the offer, turning it over in his mind the way he might examine a tactical decision. Privacy had been his refuge for 18 months. Privacy had allowed him to grieve without judgment, to weep without witnesses, to speak to Margaret without the self-consciousness that came from knowing others were listening. But privacy had also been his prison. Privacy had kept him isolated in a facility full of veterans who shared his wounds, but not his words. Privacy had convinced him that his grief was his alone to carry, that sharing it would somehow diminish it. Margaret had never believed in that kind of privacy. Margaret had believed that grief shared was grief halved, That connection was the only antidote to the poison of loss. No, Raymond said quietly. Stay, please. She would have wanted you here. She believed in witnesses. He walked the final few feet to the headstone and lowered himself onto the small bench he had placed beside it. The cold of the metal seeped through his trousers, familiar and almost comforting in its constancy. He reached out and touched the granite, his fingers tracing the letters of her name. Margaret Ellen Kowalczyk. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, friend. Her light remains. Hello, my love, he said softly, the words coming as naturally as breathing. I am sorry I'm late today. There was some trouble on the bus. But I am here now. I'm always here. The colonel and the army veteran had removed their hats, standing at a respectful distance with the solemn bearing of men who understood the sacred geography of graves. Maya Chun stood slightly apart, her hands clasped in front of her, her young face holding an expression of profound respect. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. I met some people today, Raymond continued, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. Good people, Margaret. Broken people like me. A colonel who recognized me from the old days. A soldier who served in Kandahar and came home with wounds that do not show. A young woman who sees things clearly in a world that has forgotten how to look. And a bus driver, Margaret. A bus driver whose son died in Ramadi and who had been carrying that weight alone for 17 years. He paused, feeling the familiar ache in his chest that always came when he spoke to her. But today there was something else mixed with the ache, something that felt almost like peace. You were right, he said, his voice breaking slightly. You were right about everything. There are still battles to fight. There are still people who need someone to show them that carrying weight does not mean carrying it alone. I did not understand what you meant. I thought you were asking me to do something grand, something heroic, something worthy of the medals they gave me for doing things I would rather forget. But that was not at all, was it? He lifted his eyes to the bare branches of the oak tree, watching the gray sky through the lattice of wood. You were asking me to keep living, he said. You were asking me to stay connected to the world you had to leave. You were asking me to let people see me, really see me, even when being seen felt like the hardest thing I had ever done. The colonel moved forward slowly, his footsteps soft on the gravel. Sir, he said gently, I did not know your wife. But based on what I witnessed today, I believe she would be proud of what you did on that bus. The way you chose mercy when destruction would have been easier. The way you helped a broken man find his humanity again. That is not the work of someone who has given up. That is the work of someone who is just beginning. Raymond looked up at him, this stranger who had become something more in the span of a single morning. Thank you, he said simply. The words fell inadequate, but they were true. The army veteran stepped forward, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I came home from Kandahar, believing I was alone, he said, believing no one could understand what I carried. But watching you today, listening to you speak about invisible battles and unseen wounds, I realized something. We are never as alone as we think we are. We just forget to look for each other. Maya Chun approached last, her youth somehow making her words carry even more weight. I have recorded a lot of things, she said quietly. Protests, speeches, confrontations, moments that I thought mattered. But I have never witnessed anything like what happened on that bus. And I want you to know, sir, that I am not going to post that video. Not without your permission. Because some stories are not meant to be content. Some stories are just meant to be remembered. Raymond felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of a knot he had not even known was there. He looked at the three faces surrounding him, at the headstone where Margaret's name was carved in granite, at the bare roses waiting for spring to bring them back to life. He thought about Diego Restrepo and David Michael Wilkes and all the other names he carried. He thought about the bus driver who had started the day as a petty tyrant and ended it as a father grieving for his son. He thought about Margaret, always Margaret, and the light she had left behind. Thank you, he said again, and this time the words carried everything he could not say aloud. 3 months later, Raymond stood at the front of a room filled with veterans. The space had once been a community center gymnasium, its basketball hoops folded against the walls to make room for folding chairs arranged in a rough circle. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting the kind of unflattering glow that hid nothing and forgave everything. It was not a beautiful room, but it was a room where broken people came to find their pieces, and that made it sacred. The colonel had made this happen. Franklin Okonkwo, retired Marine Corps officer turned veteran advocate, had taken Raymond to lunch the week after the bus incident and laid out his vision for a program that would do what the VA could not. No paperwork, he had explained. No bureaucracy. Just veterans helping veterans carry the weight. Raymond had listened, had considered, had thought about Margaret and Diego and David Michael Wilkes and all the invisible battles being fought on city buses and in quiet bedrooms and in the spaces between heartbeats. He had said yes. Now he stood before 43 men and women who had served their country and come home to discover that home was harder than war. Some wore the marks of their service openly, prosthetic limbs and visible scars, and the 1,000-yard stare that never quite faded. Others looked whole on the outside, but carried fragments of shrapnel in their souls that no surgery could remove. All of them had come because someone had told them about the old man on the bus. Someone had shared the story that Maya Chun had eventually posted, with Raymond's blessing, after editing it into something that protected the privacy of those who needed protecting while preserving the truth of what had happened. The video had gone viral, as such things do in a world hungry for evidence that kindness still exists. 14 million views in the first week. News interviews that Raymond had politely declined. A letter from the Secretary of Veterans Affairs that he had framed and hung in the small office Franklin had given him at the Advocacy Center. But none of that mattered as much as this room. None of that mattered as much as the faces looking up at him with hope they were afraid to trust. "My name is Raymond Kowalczyk," he said, his voice steady in a way it had not been for years. "My call sign was Shepherd, and I spent 18 months believing that my life was over because the woman I loved was gone." The room was silent. 43 pairs of eyes fixed on the old man in the worn corduroy jacket who stood before them, without pretense or posture. He had considered wearing his dress uniform for this first meeting, had thought about presenting himself as the decorated officer he had once been. But Margaret had whispered in his memory that broken people needed to see other broken people, not pedestals they could never reach. "I was wrong," Raymond continued. "My life was not over. It was waiting for me to understand that surviving is not betraying the dead. Surviving is honoring them. Every breath we take, every morning we drag ourselves out of bed, every moment we choose to keep going when giving up would be so much easier. That is how we honor the ones we lost. That is how we carry them forward." A young woman in the second row was crying silently, tears streaming down her face without shame. A man near the back gripped the arms of his chair, as if letting go would send him floating away into some void only he could see. An older veteran, gray-haired and weathered, nodded slowly with the recognition of someone who had finally heard words he had needed to hear for decades. Raymond reached into his pocket and pulled out the laminated photograph, holding it up so everyone could see. "This is Margaret," he said. "She believed I still had battles to fight when I had forgotten how to believe in anything at all. She was right. The battles are not the ones we already fought. The battles are the ones that find us when we stop running. The battles are showing up for each other when showing up feels impossible." He tucked the photograph back into his pocket, feeling its familiar weight against his chest. "We're going to meet here every week," he said. "We're going to talk about the things we carry. We're going to listen without judgment and support without conditions. We're going to remember the names of the fallen and speak them aloud so they are never forgotten. And we're going to do what the world told us we could not do. We're going to heal." After the meeting, Raymond stood outside the community center in the cool evening air, watching the veterans disperse into the darkness in small groups and solitary silhouettes. The colonel approached and stood beside him, their breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the night. "She will be proud," Franklin said quietly. Raymond nodded, his eyes on the stars emerging above the city lights. "I know," he said. "I finally know." The next morning, Raymond boarded the Route 42 Express for his twice-weekly visit to Margaret's grave. Wilkes was behind the wheel, as he had been every Tuesday and Thursday since that day 3 months ago. The driver nodded to Raymond with an expression that held no trace of the cruelty that had once defined him. "Good morning, sir," he said simply. "Good morning, Gary," Raymond replied, taking a seat near the front that no one would ever again ask him to give up. The bus pulled away from the curb, and Raymond watched the city slide past the window, the same streets he had traveled hundreds of times before. But everything looked different now. Everything felt different. The invisible battles were still being fought all around him, in the tired faces of commuters and the hunched shoulders of the elderly and the vacant stares of the young. But he could see them now. He could see them, and he could help, and that made all the difference. "Still here, Margaret," he whispered, his hand finding the photograph in his pocket. "Still fighting. Still trying. And I'm not alone anymore." The bus rolled on toward the cemetery, carrying its cargo of stories and secrets, and one old man who had finally found his way home. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible and that heroes walk among us in the most unexpected forms, please subscribe to our channel. And share in the comments who is the quiet hero in your life who deserves recognition. Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones still in uniform. Sometimes they're the ones who choose kindness when cruelty would be easier, who choose mercy when destruction is justified, who choose to keep living when giving up would be so much simpler. Thank you for watching.